So, welcome to Companion Piece, a semi-scripted sideshow companion piece where you get to hear me talk about the things that I've already talked about. Today, we're going to be talking about the background, technique, and theory surrounding Electric Skinjam, an oration in 3 parts, a piece of short speculative fiction, and best current evidence for my eventual institutionalization. If you haven't listened to Electric Skinjam, please do so first, unless you don't care about spoilers. Hint, hint. Somebody's probably going to die. So, Electric Skinjam. What was that craziness all about, right? Well, Electric Skinjam was, and this is going to be a little difficult to explain, I apologize. Electric Skinjam did not come from any particular experience or event or incident or text. It was not inspired by anything that occurred to me or happened in my life. The first thing that came was the title itself, Electric Skinjam. It just occurred. It occurred, and it was enough of a strange phrase, strange wording, and an adjective followed by a noun. And I felt that there was something in the text that I could decipher. There was something to unravel and depuzzle if I could only get my head around it. And in order to understand what the title meant, I had to begin writing. So I sat writing with the intent of essentially defining what those words meant, Electric Skinjam. And that quickly transformed into understanding how the main character, the speaker, felt. There was something in the very first line about him experiencing an in-person jam, and those just that by itself, in-person jam, provided enough of a clue to link me to the next piece, so that by about the end of the first third of the story, where he's in the room with his friends, I guess you can call him that, that I had enough of an idea where to take the narrative from there. So the entire first third was basically me sending a message to myself about what the world was about, what the background of the character was like, how he felt, and there was enough of an intimation in the intonation of the first passage that I was able to understand the character's sense of underappreciation, undervaluement, being overlooked, and so on and so forth. The feelings that, a sense of a naivete, maybe strange world-weary naivete. And there was enough to help me understand the kind of decisions that he would make. When I had people read earlier versions of this, people compared it to William Gibson, and I regret to inform people, most ashamedly, that I have actually not read anything by William Gibson. And I know he's like the progenitor of cyberpunk, or one of the progenitors of cyberpunk literature, and this is a gap in my knowledge, and I fully intend to read works by him in the future. So any at all relationship or similarity between his vision of the world, his outlook, his attitude, his writing, his prose, and mine is utterly incidental or coincidental. One of my main goals when setting out to write Electric Skinjam was to really make it more impressionistic than literal. So I wanted to tell not necessarily directly what's happening. So there's a bit of an unreliable narrator in here, right? I didn't want to tell exactly what's happening, but I wanted to give you an impression of what's happening vis-a-vis the character's very dissociated and manic and disturbed state of mind. But in order to explain what's happening and to give you some cohesive narrative, we have to stay locked into his point of view. This is in first person. So the writing itself had to become more and more abstract and chaotic in order to mimic his way of thinking, as evidenced by the rhythm and the scatological nature of the text, especially as we get further and further, and most especially towards the end of the piece, when he's essentially just going through some like fluid rap rhyme thing in his brain, rather than describing in any direct and literal way what's happening around him. The writing of the piece itself was an absolute struggle, much like the type of emotional turmoil, chaos that the main character is experiencing himself. So the writing of it reflects, or my experience in writing it reflects the writing itself and the experience of the main character as he moves through the events of the story. The story of how this is written is integral to understanding the story itself, its backgrounds, and the difficulties that went into writing it, particularly because of the energy of the piece. Once I was able to key in onto the energy and the voice of the main character and his very frantic state of mind, that is what sort of buoyed me and carried me forward through the piece. And if I couldn't latch onto it, if I couldn't latch onto that energy at any point when I sat down to write, then it just was not happening. And there were whole weeks where I sat down and I was bashing my head against the keyboard or whatever wall or whatever else is around me, trying unsuccessfully to move forward in the piece or gain any traction because I could not reach that same very manic and hyper-energized state. Once I realized that the energy of the main character could be linked to his frustration in not being noticed, and could turn that into essentially a morality tale about social media, celebrities, self-aggrandizement, the presentation of false self in online spheres. I was able to key in on what the general story is, but I wasn't able to tell exactly what was going to happen until I continued to write it. This is not one of those things that was pre-planned. It was one of those things that unfolded as I wrote it. So, but the first part of it, just the very first part, and by part I mean actually the entire third, from the very beginning all the way to the point where he's sitting with his friends in his apartment and they're watching the vid on the wall, all of that came in a single day. And more than a single day, it was one of those rare sort of Mozart-like experiences where it came almost in one single draft. There are very few changes that I've had to make since writing the first third of the text. The entire bit, it came at one time, and all I had to do was grab on and hope that I could keep up with the torrent. The setting, of course, was just this disgusting, worn down, run down district of a ward or a city referred to as the Dredges, that is more or less kind of like Kowloon Walled City was, just this one giant box where some people are just trying to get by and live their life, but is basically just a giant tenement slash drug den. We don't know where it is, we don't know what country, we don't know what year exactly. We don't know any specifics, and that level of genericism is completely intentional on my part because it's meant to imply exactly how faceless, uninvolved, and unable to engage the people in this place feel. I knew that this piece would easily bloat into something completely untenable if I kept plugging plot hole logic and providing more and more details about the world and the circumference of the world. So instead, I pulled back and keyed in on terms, neologisms, that were descriptive enough in and of themselves in order to provide enough context for you to understand what they meant and what their role in the story was. So things like skull chip, body jack, drink matrix, bit slag, deprivation room. All those terms are sort of familiar enough or solid enough to be able to understand what they mean without me having to provide more and more details. Because as I said, the more those details snowballed, the more I was going to have to provide justification for the events of this place, and that would just lead me into a size of the work that would be completely difficult to manage. And then there are the organizations in the world, such the crime syndicates, the cloud dancers, who the main character indirectly works for, the bodyjacker works for, the Grex and Shangzhou. And the cloud dancers come to the forefront more than the others simply because I just thought the name was kind of cool. And we allude to a deeper presence of the other crime syndicates in the world, maybe some surveillance organizations, some occurring. We mentioned drone cops. Ruben Red in Choker alludes to there maybe being somebody else watching the entire proceedings unfold, that kind of thing. Our main character is, again, nameless, as I often like to do. He, in fact, I refer to him internally as the nameless tweaker. And the only other thing that people call him, aside from his ridiculous stage name, Jamtastic 10, is Tweaker. And this itself is also perhaps helpful to understanding his situation. He is, in fact, utterly unsympathetic. He's cruel, crude, harsh, bombastic, and that was intentional. If you don't like him, fine. You're not supposed to like him. That's not who he is. And I personally do not come from the school of thought where I believe that I have to write some piece of relatability into every single character. I am far more interested in just depicting accurately those traits necessary to depict the inner conundrum that drives the choices of characters. He is just one of faceless thousands and millions packed into this one block that he so desperately wants to escape. And he so desperately wants to matter because he believes that he doesn't matter. And that's why he latches on to a celebrity figure like Ruben Red and this self-aggrandizing set of behavior that's apparent in how streamers are copying each other's jams. It's almost as if his entire journey, if you want to call it that, is embodied in wanting to attain a name. If he is given a name, then he has a chance to stand out and be separate from those around him. Given a jammer name, he's given a designation, almost like a rite of passage, a pain-based ritual where he has to ascend to some next level of esteem amongst his tribe, so he has a new position of authority. And the ritual that he uses to ascend essentially is what we could call the jam itself. However, this means that the environment itself can also be considered a character because it is ecologically woven into the fabric of what drives the main character himself, and that's something that I often like to do. And I allude to very, very, very subtly, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't pick up on this, to the character maybe not being originally from the Dredges. Occasionally he slips into sets of vocabulary and sets of behavior that feel like maybe he has a different background, or he comes from a more well-to-do, educated, perhaps even elite environment. This is also intimated in his tendency to look at his environment sort of in the way that an entrepreneur does, or a technologist. He looks at it as something that is changeable, as something that he can mold and shape to his own desires. None of his other friends have this, have this wherewithal. But if you take that into account and match that with the other sort of little clues that I dropped through the text, then maybe you can see that him coming from another background leads him to see the differences between his environments and the life that he lives and the environment that he could lead. There are other minor characters as well, supporting cast, such as the other tweakers who are hanging around the main character's apartment, whose lack of ambition and lack of imagination serves as a character foil to the main character himself. And there's the bodyjacker, who gets sort of a piece of the spotlight for a little bit towards the end of the text. And that man's past is alluded to, but never really discussed. It doesn't have to be, but it's clear that he didn't, as the nameless tweaker main character says, just wake up one day a cyborg. There's some tragic circumstance or background that leads him to be a essentially controller, like a drone operator for drug addicted people. And then there are the pro jammers, Ruben Red, of course, most distinctively. And there are the other ones that are talked about, like Titanical 76, you can never remember the number. And Laborust or Luborust, or one of those guys. And these are the sort of celebrity figures that the main character uses to measure his own perceived success and achievements and self-worth against. So when speaking of the plot, I didn't plan this thing from the beginning. It unfolded naturally over time. It unfolded as I was writing. So I'm not going to pretend like I had it fully bulleted out and bulletproofed from the get-go. And I kind of see it as like a photographic negative of the hero's journey, an inverse hero's journey that becomes a revenge story against a celebrity, idol, or hero figure who rejected the main character and who essentially dies to him and then is supplanted by the main character by the end of the story, where he sets out and accomplishes some grand historic task before returning to his home, which is a place of death. So it begins with the main character essentially feeling like he's not fulfilling his destiny. He's not doing something with his life that he needs to do, which in the right hands could turn into a very pro-social or altruistic drive. But in this case, because his motivations are purely inwardly focused, purely selfish, it turns destructive because it twists or perverts into pure destructive ambition. And that's sort of where the morality tale element of things comes into play. You're supposed to be watching this horrible spectacle unfold as told by a horrible person. And perhaps a horrible person who is young, naive, maybe has some redeeming value in there, but is otherwise so blind that that casts you, the audience, into a more aware light in watching his own blindness. The crux of the story hinges on the meeting with Reuben, of course, in Choker, the main character's idol and god, who I would argue at first the main character wants to emulate, right? Or not even really emulate. He doesn't really want to emulate him. He wants to become him. And in becoming him, he wants to supplant him or supersede him. And he can't do either in this case. He winds up becoming emasculated, essentially. He becomes ineffectual, and that pisses him off more than anything else, and that leads him to want to obliterate and annihilate everything. And this is ironic, of course, because in seeking to destroy the one who embodied the power dynamic that he wanted to emulate, you could say that he perhaps is trying to usurp that power dynamic itself, but in fact he only winds up adhering to it more closely. He only winds up supporting the established power structure of his world by slotting himself into it and trying to fill a role so adroitly. First bodyjacker, and before that just tweaker, and then pro jammer. So he does rise and he does place himself along the same track as anybody else does, but towards a completely self-annihilative end. And so because of that feeling of emasculation, the tweaker clearly he is only happy when he believes he has the upper hand. He is only happy when he believes he has no competition. He doesn't actually want competition. He wants to be rid of competition so that he can be in total and complete power. So he is in fact an authoritarian in the pure sense of the word. And that also explains why he so very much admires other authoritarian figures like Reuben Red and like those in power who he also secretly hates and blah blah blah. So there's a couple themes that come very much to the forefront very obviously that I think most readily encapsulate what Electric Skinjam is about. The first one most clearly is the self-destructiveness of ambition, and another would be the interdependence on your environment, right? An ecological perspective on the story. And a final one would be perhaps less so, but never meet your heroes, as the phrase goes. When looking at the theme, self-destructiveness of ambition, we really only have to look to the end of the story to see how it resolves itself. And it resolves itself cataclysmically, and it results in the death, even utter annihilation of the main character himself. So that's how we can tell that he made a bad decision. As the main character feels shirked and undermined, and feels like his value or role in society isn't being respected in some way, he feels like his individualism isn't being respected in some way, he responds in a self-destructive way. He responds by ramping up his ambition, by ramping up the facets of himself that will ultimately lead to a more pressurized life, a more pressurized state. When we look at the interdependence on the environment, that one again should be somewhat self-explanatory. No matter where the nameless tweaker came from, he is in the dredges. He is one with the dredges. The dredges represents him as he represents it. And as they all essentially are one cohered single unit of decay. If he, the nameless tweaker, wants to ascend, he wants to elevate, he wants to transcend his surroundings and environment and become something better, greater, more relevant, whatever it is, he can't do that and leave where he came from behind. He can't do the same thing to those around him that he is upset at being done to him. He can't shirk and leave them behind. He can't forget where he came from. He can't remove those pieces of himself that are of decay, of that environment, of where he came from. His entire set of motivations is dependent on that context and that situation. If that same person, the same inclinations, the same driving force was in a separate environment, yes, he might wind up being self-destructive, but it would not be in the same way. He is reliant on the circumstances of his surroundings in order to decide on a course of action and in order to take the steps that he decides to take that lead him to an ultimately destructive end. And the final point, don't meet your heroes. Of course, as they say, I don't necessarily agree with that statement, but it serves as a theme in this case because look what happens when he meets Reuben Red, right? Somehow, he believes that he has a personal connection to this man. He believes that the work, the creative work, whatever it is, no matter what value you believe it has, he believes that this man's creative work was sort of developed specifically for him. He feels a personal one-on-one connection to it. He doesn't understand it as a removed, separate sort of a product that a whole bunch of people can interact with and can mean a whole bunch of different things to a whole bunch of different people. But instead, he believes that it is something that has the greatest degree of relevance to him. He's the one who understands it. He's the one who appreciates it. He's the one who gets Reuben and Reuben's work. And when that when that inclination is not validated or verified, he basically, short circuits. He self-destructs. He doesn't know what to do. He implodes. He doesn't know how to reconcile his love, his ardor of this individual and his work with the reality of what he sees before him, which is that the name's tweaker, does not matter in the greater equation. That his own feelings, his inclinations, beliefs are not relevant to this greater thing that is so relevant towards him. That's what fries his mind. That's what pisses him off to no end. That's what pushes him off the deep end. When speaking of the theory or technique used to create Electric Skinjam, there was no theoretical model I was trying to emulate. There was no literary theory that I was trying to explore or understand. It was purely a spontaneous, energetic aesthetic. I wanted to capture an aesthetic feeling of words and sounds and images and impressions and emotions, and use those things to portray a picture of, ecstasy, elation, mania, and cruelty. However, if there is any theory or theoretical framework that we can compare it to, it wouldn't be a literary one, but it would be an ontological one. And at risk of transforming this video into an enormously long venture, I will simply incorporate the lessons learned from OOO, object-oriented ontology, into a description of the theoretical framework that you could compare this work to. So people ask of books and stories and pieces of art and sculptures and things hanging on walls and on shelves. Words themselves, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? And if we ask that question alone, then we run the risk of believing that the greatest value of a work lies in its most mechanical or reductible parts, as if something is at its purest form when we break it down into its smallest components, as if a person is at their best or at their most understandable, at their most real or most true, if we break them down to a collection of cells and electric sparks and organic matter, as if the entire narrative exists to be solely interpreted in terms of its literalism and the facts of things, which is frankly the driest, most graceless way to define something, in my opinion, the least sacred even. It leaves us with nothing but the non-sumptuousness of events. It leaves us with a dead set of material objects and terms and phrases that are themselves without any joie de vivre. In general, the story was an attempt at playing with the bombast and hyperbole of language in order to expose through imagery and figuratism the truth of the absurdity of the events of the story. Now, of course, by that definition alone, you could say that I just described all types of prose, because we play with language to expose the inner worlds of things, yeah, by contrasting language against events, but this isn't the case with literal statements, not really, literal statements. The apple is red as a sentence does not really reveal very much about the apple. It doesn't tell us anything about its shared cultural significance, the Adam and Eve story, the associated litany of literary allusions, its role in culinary circles, desserts, baking. It doesn't tell us about the history of how to cook apple pie. Nothing. We learn really nothing of relevance except maybe that if we're looking for an apple and we see something that's red, that red thing could possibly be an apple, red and round and shiny. So by attempting to apply an endless, inexhaustible list of descriptors to an object, we are essentially demonstrating the inadequacy of literal language by drawing attention to the inherently contradictory use of ever more abstract descriptors that we have to use if we wish to apply a more substantive definition of a supposedly literal statement about an object like an apple. In so doing, we are essentially comparing a singular tangible object against a shared collection of words that itself do not do anything but define an idealized shared notion of what an apple is. If I make a sentence, if I say a sentence that sounds like it's supposed to make sense, sounds like it could make sense, sounds like it describes something real, much like the title of Electric Skinjam itself, then you automatically want to understand what it means. You automatically want to decode it, you want to decipher it. Our first instinct is to ask maybe, what does it mean, especially in this day and age? But more important than what it means in a literal sense is what the words are doing to your consciousness as you try to interpret what it means. If you focus on trying to understand what it means, you will miss out on trying to understand what the attempt to understand is doing to your conscious mind as you are trying to understand. Got that? The words are essentially just a cipher for something that you will never totally understand and arguably shouldn't, because poetic language does not exist to provide literal direct statements. It exists to provoke the mind into new ways of thinking. So how does this relate to Electric Skinjam? Electric Skinjam is indicative of, on miniature, what I like to do in a lot of other pieces, and that is what I call word painting. So think about the analogy, word painting. Imagine you're painting, the order of how you paint, the spatial relationships of lines to other things, the order in which you put the materials on the canvas, and what in the end all of it collectively depicts or expresses. In that case, the canvas itself doesn't change. The basic process of applying paint to the canvas doesn't change, but the more conforming to literalism and the more conforming to rules of three-dimensional space is the object, like walking down a street in Paris or a bowl of fruit on a table, then the more specific must the guidelines be for how the contents of the process are depicted. In other words, if it's a literal thing, then the process must innately become more rigidified. And I'm not talking about what you paint first, not the order. There are simply more concrete rules that must be obeyed. And the more specific and concrete and literal you get, the more beholden you are to the concrete. And therefore, if we're creating something that's abstract, then the more you are able to abide by a sense of principles that represent an inner world that is far more inexplicable and inexpressible, so that the expression of that inner world need not conform to any real-world object, no matter what real-world objects surround the thing that has an inner life or a sense of itself. And this is what I was doing with Electric Skinjam, more and more as it reflects the sort of a fugue-like dissociative state of the main character. I am describing something through word painting. The less relevant the depiction of a physical, linear, or literal sequence of space-time becomes, then the more fluid the application of the symbols to the medium, words to a page, paint to a canvas, can become as well. And when we're done, we can step back and look at the entire portrait, dab by dab, stroke by stroke, word by word, phoneme by phoneme, stress by syllable, by intonation. All of it together can be viewed in totality, can be viewed as a single word, can be viewed on the whole, can be viewed as a single portrait, in this case bound by a page or bound by some border within which the entire image is contained. I am not interested, ultimately and inevitably, in deploying a sequential row of words that depict in order events happening as per the actions of entity A which cause outcome B. That is not the ultimate goal here. The ultimate goal is to simply place points of the pieces of a puzzle that are themselves a melange of abstraction that, in sum, demonstrates a feeling or whole image that encapsulates the experience I want to represent. And we can follow what's happening based on the key terms that I mentioned earlier and based on whatever the focal points are in the language that point to concrete or readily identifiable objects in the environment. So, Electric Skinjam, a disturbing portrait of what happens when a kid doesn't feel appreciated. It's an attempt to portray abstractly the confusion that sets into a mind that is already further confused by self-destructive habits as it tries to claw its way out of a hell of circumstances. And I hope that even if the main character himself is not sympathetic, because he's not, I hope that central core message, which I believe we already know, don't we, can come through in some way. I felt it was necessary when writing to not hedge on the brutality of the piece or even try to engender care on your part, because that is what the main character himself would do. And I wanted the piece to represent him and his state of mind and the severity of the circumstances and the environment that he came from. Maybe in the end, the text is just a club to the jaw that tries to communicate exactly how tragic and impossibly inextricable a person is from their circumstances and their environment. If so, fine. Though I don't mind saying right now that I do have a follow-up to Electric Skinjam planned, possibly two. They aren't sequels, but they are sequential. They come after the fact and after the events that happen in Electric Skinjam, and they are a direct consequence of or direct result of the events that happen in Electric Skinjam as well. But I wanted to focus on bringing up the core backdrop of the world and using the implicit lore and environmental details that were present in Electric Skinjam to expand into a different area of the entire world. Maybe different socioeconomic strata, maybe a different physical environment, different geographical location. I do have some of the characters and basic maybe narrative threads pegged down, but nothing specific. And looking at how much of a chaotic process the first one was, Electric Skinjam was, I really doubt this is going to be coming down the pipe anytime soon. So if you're looking forward to that or thinking of that, I apologize. But as you can imagine, it's going to take a little while to get into the right frame of mind in order to be able to write this next piece. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate the support. Please know how much it means to me. I really hope this video was informative and instructive to you. I hope it gave you a little bit of insight into the writing process if you yourself are a writer or a creative individual of any sort. If you do support me on Patreon, you will be receiving copies of Electric Skinjam in either PDF, EPUB, or MOBI form. It's up to you, of course. And you will also be receiving an audio file of Electric Skinjam in case you don't want to look at my face, which I wouldn't blame you. And please feel free to subscribe and like, comment, etc. Follow me on the usual platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Goodreads in this case. This is literature we're talking about. As always, happy reading, happy writing, happy creating, no matter the medium. Take care. Until next time, I am the orator.